The four words stopped me cold the moment they left her lips. Help me get even. I had never expected to hear anything like that from my grandmother. Not from Alina Navarro. Not from a woman who had spent 8 decades on this earth, teaching everyone around her that grace was stronger than grievance. She was the kind of woman who didn't raise her voice when she could raise the room. The kind of woman whose very presence made strangers straighten their posture and former soldiers blink back unexpected tears. She had given 24 years of her life to the United States Navy as a surgical nurse. She had spent the 3 decades that followed giving even more of herself to everyone else. And yet there she sat, in her own kitchen, alone, crying quietly into a cup of tea that had long gone cold, while her own children sat in the next room deciding what to do with her house, her money, and her future. My name is Cassandra Navarro. Most people call me Cass. I hold the rank of Lieutenant Commander in the United States Navy, and at the time all of this unfolded, I had just wrapped up a training rotation in Virginia that ended 72 hours ahead of schedule. Rather than wait around base killing time, I decided to drive straight to Indiana to surprise my grandmother. I hadn't seen her in over 4 months. We spoke every Sunday without fail, but phone calls, no matter how long or how warm, can never substitute for the real thing. Grandma Alina was the gravitational center of my entire childhood. After my grandfather passed away from a heart condition when I was 6, my parents became consumed by the relentless machinery of adult life, careers, bills, ambition, survival. They weren't bad people. They were just busy ones, and busy people often leave gaps in children's lives that someone else has to fill. Alina filled every single one of mine. She was the one who sat in the second row at every one of my school performances, front and center enough to see my face, but not so close it would embarrass me. She taught me how to parallel park in an empty church parking lot on a rainy Tuesday afternoon, both of us laughing so hard we could barely breathe. She sat beside my hospital bed when I fractured my collarbone in a soccer accident at 13, and she held my hand through the night, even though she had a volunteer shift at the Veterans Center the very next morning. She went anyway. She was also the reason I chose the Navy. I figured she'd be thrilled to see me. I figured I'd knock on her door, and she'd pull me into one of those hugs that somehow make you feel 8 years old and completely safe all at once. I had no idea what I was about to walk into. The driveway told the first part of the story before I even reached the front porch. My father's truck, my mother's SUV, Uncle Dominic's rust-patched Ford, 3 vehicles that had no business being parked in Alina Navarro's driveway at 10 o'clock on a Wednesday morning. Nobody had mentioned anything to me. No family gathering, no holiday, no emergency. Just 3 vehicles sitting there like an ambush. I cut the engine and stepped out. Before I had even cleared the walkway, voices reached me through the living room window, sharp voices, clipped voices, the kind people use when they're negotiating something and don't want to be overheard. My uncle's voice first: "We should move on this before the weather turns." My father answering: "Agreed, no point dragging it out." I stopped walking. Then Uncle Dominic laughed, a short, businesslike laugh. "The property alone has to be worth close to $450 in this market, maybe more." The property. My stomach dropped 3 inches. Then my mother's voice drifted through the screen, smooth and practical the way it always was when she'd already made up her mind about something. And she won't need access to most of her accounts once she's settled in somewhere. I stood on that walkway for 5 full seconds. Just stood there. Because some part of me genuinely needed those 5 seconds to make sure I was hearing what I thought I was hearing. Settled in somewhere. Assisted living. They were talking about putting Alina Navarro, a woman who still shoveled her own snow, still drove herself to Sunday Mass, still led a veterans grief support group every other Thursday. They were talking about installing her in a managed care facility like a piece of furniture being moved to storage. Without asking her, without telling her, without involving anyone. Without telling me. I pushed through the front door. The living room went silent like someone had cut a wire. 3 faces turned toward me with identical expressions, not joy, not relief, not even the mild embarrassment of people caught discussing something personal. just discomfort. The specific discomfort of people who know they've been found out. Cass, my mother said my name the way people say uh-oh. What are you doing here? I looked at each of them in turn. Then I looked at the coffee table. It was covered in papers, property assessment printouts, glossy retirement community brochures, what looked like financial account summaries. Documents that absolutely did not belong in Eleanor Navarro's living room without Eleanor Navarro's knowledge. Training ended early, I said. My father forced a laugh and ran a hand through his thinning hair. Well, there's a surprise. I asked one question, where's Grandma? Nobody answered right away. That pause told me everything I needed to know. Finally, my mother pointed toward the hallway leading to the kitchen, the gesture small and slightly guilty. I walked through. She was sitting at the kitchen table with her back to the window. Morning light was coming in from the garden outside, the same garden where she'd grown tomatoes and snap peas every summer for as long as I could remember. The light should have looked warm. Instead, it just made everything feel lonelier. Her coffee mug sat untouched. Steam had long since stopped rising from it. And Eleanor Navarro, 77 years old, the woman who had held the hands of dying sailors in military hospitals without flinching, who had buried her husband and kept going, who had marched through every difficult chapter of her life with her shoulders squared and her chin level, was sitting there with wet eyes and a crumpled tissue pressed against her palm. The sight of it did something to me that I wasn't prepared for. I crossed the kitchen without a word and wrapped both arms around her from behind. The second I did, she broke, not loudly, not with any performance, just quietly, the way people cry when they've been holding it for hours and have finally run out of strength to keep holding. Her hand came up and gripped my forearm. I stayed like that until she was ready to let go. I'm sorry, she said when she finally pulled back, reaching up to touch my face. You weren't supposed to see this. Don't apologize, I said. Don't you dare apologize. She managed a thin smile, then her gaze drifted toward the hallway. They've been here since 8 this morning. I pulled a chair around and sat beside her, close enough that our knees were almost touching. Tell me what happened. She looked down at her coffee for a long moment, turning the mug slowly with both hands. Then she looked up. They've decided I'm becoming a problem, she said. Her voice was completely level. That made it worse somehow. A problem. They call it a burden. She said the word with a gentleness that I found unbearable, the same tone she might have used to describe a minor inconvenience, a leaking faucet, a cancelled appointment. They're concerned about my future, about making sure I'm somewhere safe. Grandma's. They want me to sign papers. She nodded toward the living room. They brought them today. I stood up. I don't remember making the decision. One moment I was sitting, and the next I was on my feet and turning toward the hallway, because every cell in my body had arrived at the same conclusion simultaneously. I was going to walk into that living room. I was going to pick up every single one of those documents and... Her hand closed around my wrist. The grip was firm, surprising for a woman of her size, surprising for someone who'd been crying 2 minutes ago. I stopped, turned back, and when I looked at her face, I saw something I hadn't expected. She wasn't afraid, she wasn't desperate, she was thinking. There was a calculation in her eyes that I recognized from a very specific context, the stories she used to tell about the difficult days in her nursing career, the impossible calls, the moments when the wrong decision at the wrong time cost someone everything. She always got that look right before she made the right call under pressure. Quiet, precise, 3 moves ahead. Don't, she said. Grandma, they. Not yet. She released my wrist and straightened in her chair, and suddenly she looked 10 years younger. Sit back down, Cass. I need to show you something. She glanced once toward the hallway to confirm no one was listening. Then she leaned in, and her voice dropped to just above a whisper. They think they know everything about me. A pause. They don't. I sat down slowly. What do you mean? She lifted her gaze toward the ceiling, toward the floor above us, and specifically, as I realized in the same instant my memory caught up with me, toward the attic. There's a trunk up there, she said. Your grandfather's old Navy footlocker. I knew exactly what she was talking about. I had seen it as a child, a heavy navy blue military chest in the far corner of the attic, padlocked and dusty, the kind of thing children are warned not to touch. I had never seen it open. Nobody had, as far as I knew. There are things in that trunk, she said slowly, that none of them have ever thought to ask about. Her eyes came back to mine. Help me bring it down. And then, softly, precisely, with a composure that I can only describe as tacty. Cal, she said the words that changed everything. Help me get even. She wasn't broken. She had never been broken. She was loading her weapon. The next 20 minutes felt like a covert operation. Eleanor choreographed it with the quiet efficiency of someone who had spent decades working in environments where timing was the difference between a good outcome and a catastrophe. She waited until my mother announced she was starting a fresh pot of coffee. She waited a beat longer, until the sound of conversation drew my father and uncle out to the back porch to look at property listing photos on someone's phone. Then she nodded at me once. I went. The attic stairs creaked under every step. It smelled the way attics do, like time compressed into dust. Around me, in labeled cardboard boxes and garment bags and stacked containers, were 40 years of a family's accumulated history. But in the far corner, under a canvas tarp that had faded from green to gray, sat the footlocker. Navy blue, metal cornered, scarred with the kind of wear that comes not from neglect but from having traveled. The lock was old but solid. I carried it carefully down the stairs, and when I set it on the kitchen floor, Eleanor ran one hand slowly across the lid the way you'd touch the shoulder of someone you hadn't seen in a very long time. I haven't opened this since the year your grandfather passed, she said. She reached into the pocket of her cardigan and produced a small brass key. The lock disengaged with a clean, final click. I expected important papers. I expected something legal, something financial, something that would serve as evidence or leverage in whatever confrontation was coming. What I found was a life. Letters, hundreds of them, sorted by year and bound with rubber bands that had long since gone brittle. Photographs in protective sleeves, Eleanor in uniform at 23, dark-haired and straight-backed, with the confident eyes of someone who had already decided who she was going to be. Military commendation documents. A meritorious service medal still in its presentation box. Newspaper clippings. Handwritten cards on every kind of stationery you can imagine. I picked up the first photograph. You were extraordinary, I said. I meant it as a simple observation. It came out as something closer to awe. She laughed a real laugh, the first I'd heard all morning. Past tense. Are you fishing for a compliment? At 77, she said, you've earned the right. We sat together for the next hour going through the trunk piece by piece, and with every item, another layer of a story I had never fully known came into focus. I found a letter from a man named Thomas Calloway, written in 1981. He'd been a young sailor, 22 years old, recovering from shrapnel injuries, and what the letter carefully described as a very dark period of mind. He wrote that Eleanor had visited him every day for 6 weeks during his recovery, not because it was required, not because he was her assigned patient, because she noticed that nobody else was coming. He had gone on to become a high school history teacher, then a principal. He had 4 grandchildren and a garden he was proud of. The final line of the letter read, "If you had not decided I was worth saving, I would not have survived long enough to find out that I was." I had to stop reading aloud for a moment. He was a good man, Eleanor said simply. Most people would have this letter framed. She shrugged. It was never about the recognition. Letter after letter told variations of the same story. A life given, quietly and without fanfare, to the serious business of helping other people through their worst moments. None of it had ever been announced. None of it had ever been leveraged for sympathy or social currency. It had simply been done, and then folded into a cardboard box and stored in an attic, because Eleanor Navarro had never once confused doing good with needing to be seen doing good. Then I found the financial records. They were tucked inside a plain manila folder near the bottom of the trunk, and at first I thought they were personal bank statements. Then I started reading the names. My father, my uncle Dominic, 3 of my cousins, amounts that made me go very still. $12,000, 22,000, 8,000, 36,000, 15,000. Loan after undisclosed loan, year after year, each one marked in Aliner's careful handwriting with the recipient's name, the date, and a single column for repayment entries. That repayment column was almost entirely blank. She helped, I said, more to myself than to her, all those times. They needed help, Aliner said. I looked up. Did they pay you back? The smile she gave me was answer enough. I sat back in my chair and felt the last 20 years of my life rearrange themselves slightly. The summer my parents nearly lost their house when I was 14. The year Uncle Dominic's small contracting. Business collapsed, and he showed up at Christmas looking hollowed out. My cousin Reggie's college tuition that somehow materialized when everyone said it couldn't. The medical emergency my aunt had in 2017 that seemed to resolve itself financially without any explanation. Aliner had been the explanation, over and over and over again, without ever once saying so. Did they know, I asked, do they know now how much you've done? She considered the question seriously, the way she considered everything. When it happened, yes, they were grateful, people usually are. A pause. But gratitude has a shelf life when it's inconvenient. That sentence landed on me like a stone. The deeper we searched, the clearer the full picture became. Near the bottom of the trunk, wrapped in a cloth, was a worn leather journal. Aliner handed it to me with both hands, like it had weight beyond the physical. This matters more than any of the rest of it, she said. I opened it carefully. The handwriting inside was Aliner's, the same precise, unhurried cursive from the financial records. But here it was personal, reflective, the private notations of a woman thinking through her own life in real time. One entry stopped me. It had been written shortly after my grandfather died. I read it silently first, then aloud. Today I learned that grief and responsibility are not opposites. They occupy the same room. I miss him more than I know how to say. But the children still need someone, and so tomorrow I will get up and be that person. That is what we do. That is what it means to love something bigger than your own pain. I closed the journal. Neither of us spoke for a moment. You never stopped getting up, I finally said. Neither will you, she replied. It wasn't consolation, it was a statement of fact. Then I asked the question I'd been circling, since the moment she said what she said in the kitchen. What did you mean? When you said you wanted to get even, what did you actually mean? Aliner set down the photograph she'd been holding and looked at me steadily. I don't want to hurt them, she said. I waited. I don't want them embarrassed in front of strangers. I don't want them to suffer. She folded her hands on the table. I want something far more difficult than any of that. What? Her eyes were very clear. I want them to see themselves accurately. The kitchen was quiet. From outside, I could hear my father's voice carrying faint and distant through the back wall, something about market timing and capital gains. He had no idea what was happening in his mother's kitchen. They've spent years, Aliner continued, constructing a version of themselves that they can live with comfortably. Good children, concerned family, responsible adults looking out for an aging parent. She paused. I want them to stand inside the true version for long enough that it changes something. I held her gaze. That's not revenge. No, she agreed, it isn't. Then she reached into the trunk one final time and removed a sealed envelope that was obviously newer than everything else. Crisp, unweathered, recently placed there. She set it in front of me. My name was written across the front in her handwriting. Open it, she said. Inside the envelope were 3 documents. The first was a letter from an attorney in Columbus. The second was from a certified financial planner. The third was the founding charter of something called the Aliner Navarro Veterans Service Foundation. I stared at the name on the page for several seconds. Then I looked up. You started a foundation. 5 years ago. 5 years ago. I said it twice because I needed to. You've been managing a private veterans foundation for 5 years and nobody in this family knew. She looked mildly pleased with herself. No one asked. I kept reading. The Foundation's mission was specific and practical: emergency financial assistance for veterans and their families, scholarships for dependents of active duty and retired service members, and the line that hit me hardest: housing support programs to help elderly veterans maintain independence in their own homes rather than being moved into facilities against their wishes. She had built the thing she needed most as a monument to everyone else who needed it too. The financial commitments she had made to the foundation were significant, not ruinous, but substantial, a meaningful portion of assets that my father and uncle had apparently been mentally cataloging for themselves, without anyone in the family being aware those assets had long since been designated elsewhere. I started laughing. Not a polite laugh, a real one surprised out of me. Grandma. She was doing her best to look innocent. She was not succeeding. I shook my head. They spent months building a case for why you need to be managed. They have spreadsheets, they have brochures, they have an entire argument assembled around your assets. I held up the foundation. Documents, and the assets aren't where they think they are. People often see what they're looking for, she said, instead of what's actually there. There was one more document in the envelope: the revised estate plan, executed just 3 months earlier. I read it carefully, twice. The house would be sold eventually, yes. The proceeds would flow to the foundation. Remaining assets would be distributed. And then came the conditions, clear, legally binding, non-negotiable, and utterly characteristic of the woman who'd written them. Anyone receiving an inheritance from Alina Navarro's estate would first be required to complete documented community service. Not a token gesture, actual hours, with verification. They would participate in veteran support programs. They would complete a financial stewardship course and provide proof. And perhaps most pointedly, they would spend meaningful time working with programs that helped elderly individuals maintain independence in their own homes. The conditions weren't cruel, they weren't punitive, they were pedagogical. You're not punishing them, I said. No. You're enrolling them. She almost smiled. I prefer to think of it as redirecting. I set the documents down and looked at my grandmother, really looked at her. The woman who had been weeping at this table 2 hours ago. The woman my family had spent months discussing as though she were a problem to be solved rather than a person to be known. She hadn't been falling apart, she had been waiting. She had been so far ahead of everyone in that house that it almost wasn't a fair contest. You planned all of this, I said. I've had time. The family meeting was scheduled for a Saturday afternoon, 3 weeks later. I stayed in Indiana the entire time on accumulated leave, helping Alina prepare. She chose the venue herself, the community hall attached to the local Veterans Center, a modest room with folding chairs and fluorescent lights, and a bulletin board full of volunteer sign-up sheets. Not her home, not a law office. Here, where she had spent 30 years of volunteer hours, where people knew her not as someone's mother or someone's estate asset, but as a leaner. We spent those 3 weeks making calls and assembling the documentation. Letters printed and organized. Financial records prepared clearly and professionally. Foundation materials made available. A careful, factual record of decades assembled without drama, without editorializing, without anything that could be characterized as an attack. The response to Alina's invitations was something I wasn't quite prepared for. Nearly everyone said yes within 24 hours. Veterans in their 60s and 70s, former colleagues, neighbors, a retired judge who'd been Alina's Sunday school classmate, the director of a regional veterans advocacy organization, a retired 2-star general named Harold Bryce, whom Alina mentioned almost offhandedly, as though running into decorated generals who owed you a personal debt was entirely unremarkable. When I raised an eyebrow at that one, she said only, "He had a very difficult year once. I visited." Of course she did. Meanwhile, back at the house, the pressure from my family continued to escalate. My father began calling daily. My uncle Dominic increased his visits. The documents on the coffee table were replaced by newer, more urgent documents. Everyone was very concerned. Everyone was only thinking about Alina's well-being. Everyone was growing frustrated that she kept saying not today. She told me to observe and not engage, and I had learned enough in 3 weeks to trust her judgment on that. So I watched. I watched my father use the phrase, your future security, 11 times across 4 visits, without once asking Alina what she herself felt secure about. I watched my uncle Dominic spend 40 minutes describing the amenities at a lakeside assisted living facility. The heated pool, the dining room, the vibrant activity calendar, without making a single reference to the Veterans Center, where Alina had been showing up twice a week for 3 decades. One afternoon, Alina interrupted him mid-sentence. Dominic, her voice was pleasant. In the past year, have you once come to see me when you didn't also want something? He opened his mouth, he closed it again. The question simply hung there, perfectly placed, requiring no follow-up. The day of the family meeting arrived cool and overcast, the kind of Indiana autumn afternoon that smells like dried leaves and approaching winter. I got to the community hall early. By the time the doors were officially open, 2 rows of chairs were already occupied. By 20 minutes past the hour, the room was close to full. Veterans with service caps and branch insignias on their jackets. A retired schoolteacher who lived 3 blocks from Alina's house and had apparently been the recipient of 17 home-cooked meals during a difficult illness she'd never mentioned to her own family. The widow of a Vietnam-era veteran who started weeping quietly before she'd even found her seat. My father arrived with my mother, then Uncle Dominic. I watched them take in the room and genuinely couldn't tell if the expression on my father's face was confusion or the first early tremors of understanding. My mother leaned close to my father. What is this? Nobody answered. At exactly 1:30, Alina Navarro walked to the front of the room. The conversation stopped. Not gradually, not as people noticed her and quieted their neighbors. Instantly, the entire room simply stopped, the way rooms do for people who have spent decades earning that particular kind of quiet. She thanked everyone for coming. She told them what the gathering was for, not a confrontation, not a legal proceeding, but an accounting, a true picture of a life. She said that sometimes the people who love us most see us least clearly, and that the only cure for that was honest information. Then she invited her guests to speak. What followed lasted nearly 40 minutes, and I will not reduce it to a summary. A veteran named Frank described sitting in a VA waiting room 14 years ago, having made a decision he intended to act on that evening. Alina had been there for an unrelated appointment, had sat down beside him without being asked, and had simply talked with him for 2 hours, not about his pain, not about his plans, but about his life. About what he had seen and survived and built. He canceled the decision he'd made. He went home. He was still going home. The room was very quiet after he spoke. A woman in her 70s described a year of paperwork Alina had navigated on her behalf after her husband died. Benefits claims and insurance disputes, and estate tangles that would have bankrupted the woman in legal fees. Alina had done it for free, in her own time, across 18 months. A former colleague from Alina's nursing years shared a story about a patient no one believed would recover. Alina had believed it loudly enough to compensate for everyone else's doubt. Story after story, life after life, a room full of evidence that one woman's choices had rippled outward further than anyone standing in that hall could fully calculate. By the 4th story, my mother's hands were clasped tightly in her lap. By the 6th, my father had stopped looking up. Uncle Dominic, for the first time in my memory, simply sat still. Then I stood up. I carried the folder of financial records to the front of the room and I read. Not dramatically, not with editorial commentary, not with anger in my voice, just the facts. The dates and the amounts and the names and the circumstances. The first loan, the second, the third through the 12th, the mortgage rescue, the business bailout, the tuition, the medical bills. Years, names, amount, outcome. With every item I read, I watched my father's posture change incrementally, the way a structure settles when something load-bearing shifts. When I finished reading the last entry, I returned to my seat and Alina stood. The room turned toward her like it was the only natural thing to do. She looked at her children, at her brother-in-law, and then at the room around them, All those people whose lives she had touched quietly over decades, all those witnesses to who she actually was. She let the silence hold for a moment. "I've changed my estate plans," she said. The room held its breath. My father looked up sharply. Alina explained the foundation, its existence, its 5-year history, its ongoing work, the assets she had committed to it. She watched the expressions on her children's faces move through surprise and into something more complicated as they absorbed the fact that they had spent months planning around a version of her financial situation that had never accurately existed. My father found his voice first. "What foundation?" "The one I established 5 years ago," Alina said, "to help veterans maintain independence in their own homes." The specific choice of words, "maintain independence in their own homes," landed where she intended it to. She explained the terms of the revised estate plan, the community service requirements, the veteran support participation, the financial stewardship courses. She explained that these were not punishments and not tricks, and not the actions of a woman acting in grief or anger. They were conditions set by someone who understood, from a lifetime of observation, that money delivered to people without character either reveals the absence of character or accelerates its erosion. My father said, "You're serious." "Very," said Alina. My mother asked why. Alina answered immediately. "Because inheritance without accountability is a way of saying I love you and I expect nothing of you, and I have never believed that was a loving thing to say." Dominic stood. He looked shrunken somehow, smaller than I was used to seeing him. When he spoke, his voice had lost its negotiating tone entirely. "Do you think we're bad people?" The question seemed to surprise even him as it came out sincere, stripped down, unexpectedly vulnerable. Alina took her time before answering. "No, Dominic, I don't think you're bad people." She looked at all three of them. "I think you got busy. I think the practical details of your own lives crowded out other things. I think that happens to a great many people, and I think it happened to you gradually enough that no one noticed, including you." She paused. "The saddest part isn't that you wanted my money. People want things, that's human." Another pause. "The saddest part is that in all the months of planning and discussing and preparing documents, not one of you asked whether I was happy." Nobody in the room moved. Several people bowed their heads, not in shame, but in recognition. The expression of people encountering something true that they've encountered before in their own lives, in their own families, in their own mirrors at unexpected moments. My mother started crying. Real tears, not performance. The kind that arrive when a person's internal narrative about themselves runs directly into an incompatible fact, and the collision cannot be ignored. "I'm sorry, Mom," she said, barely above a whisper. "I'm so sorry." Alina let the moment exist. She didn't rush to comfort. She didn't rush to forgive. She understood, better than anyone in that room, that some things need to breathe before they can heal. My father stood. I had watched this man navigate job loss, financial stress, serious illness, years of difficulty. I had never seen his face look the way it looked in that moment, not broken, not defeated, but confronted. Confronted with the gap between who he believed he was and who he had actually become. "I thought we were helping," he said. The words sounded inadequate to him even as he said them. I could see it. "I believe part of you did," Alina said. The honesty of that acknowledgement, the refusal to make him simply a villain, the insistence on complexity even when simplicity would have been satisfying, was the most like her I had seen her all day. The meeting continued for another hour. More stories, questions answered, legal specifics explained by the Columbus attorney who had accompanied Alina, but the temperature in the room had changed entirely and not in the direction of a battle. When the guests finally began to leave, they came to Alina one at a time. A handshake, a hug, a hand held for a moment. The veterans last, several of them, in that formal, wordless way that carries a specific gravity. When only family remained, the room was very quiet. Uncle Dominic broke the silence. "I owe you an apology," he said. His voice was rough. "Yes," said Alina, "just that. Not warm, not cold, true." My mother crossed the room first and held her, and they stayed that way for a long time. My father followed. Then Dominic, awkwardly, the way men who aren't practiced at this do it, but he did it. I stood at the edge of the room and watched four broken people begin the slow, imperfect, necessary work of turning toward each other. And I saw Alina, over my father's shoulder, glance across the room at me. The look on her face was the same one she'd worn in the kitchen that morning, not triumphant, not relieved, just clear-eyed and steady, the expression of someone who made the right call under pressure and knew it. The months that followed were not a transformation. Let me be honest about that. Real change doesn't arrive in a single afternoon and stay forever. Families don't recalibrate overnight. Trust that eroded across years doesn't reconstitute in weeks. Alina knew that better than anyone, and she never pretended otherwise. But things moved. My father called me on a random Thursday 4 weeks after the meeting. No reason, he said, just calling. Then, almost as an afterthought, I started volunteering at the VA regional office. Just clerical work. Nothing impressive, a pause, it's something. It's something, I agreed. My mother began delivering meals to homebound elderly residents in her town. She did it quietly, without announcement, every Tuesday morning, regardless of weather. When I asked her about it once, she said only, it was time. Uncle Dominic complied with every condition in the estate plan, while audibly resenting all of it. He grumbled through every volunteer shift, complained through every veterans event, and arrived at every single one without being asked twice. Something about that pattern struck me as more genuine than cheerful compliance would have been. Alina thought so too. He's showing up, she said once, when I relayed another Dominic complaint. That matters more than how he feels about it. I returned to active duty, and my own life resumed its familiar rhythm. But I called Alina every evening, and those conversations became something I organized the rest of my day around. The following spring, her health began to shift in small ways. Slower mornings, more rest, a new medication, then an adjusted dosage. She remained sharp and opinionated and entirely herself, but age was doing what age does, quietly and without asking permission. When I could get leave, I flew home. Those visits had a different quality now, precious in the way that things become when you stop pretending they'll always be available. One summer evening, almost exactly a year after everything had happened, we sat together on her front porch. The kind of Indiana summer evening that turns gold and then amber and then disappears into something almost purple, with the fireflies just beginning at the edge of the yard and the whole neighborhood settling into quiet. We sat for a while without speaking. Then Alina said, "Do you remember what I asked you?" "Help me get even," I said. She laughed softly, not my finest phrasing. "It worked." "It did." She looked out at the yard for a moment. "Cass, I need you to hold on to something." I turned toward her. "People are going to disappoint you," she said. "People are going to let you down. Occasionally, the people who are supposed to love you the most are going to be the ones who hurt you in ways you didn't see coming." "I know. That's not the part I need you to remember." She reached over and took my hand, the same way she had in the kitchen that morning a year ago. The same grip, firm, certain, grounding. "The part I need you to remember is what you do after." I waited. "You can answer hurt with hurt. You can become the person who collects grievances and deploys them. You can build walls so thorough and so well constructed that nothing can get through, not the people who deserve to be kept out and not the ones who don't." She paused. "Many people do, it's understandable. It even feels like strength for a while." The fireflies were out in earnest now, small interruptions of light in the dusk. "But it costs you something," she said. "Every day a little more, until the protection and the prison are the same thing." I thought about the family meeting, about my father's face, about what it had taken Alina, not just the planning, not just the foundation and the documents and the 3 weeks of preparation, but what it had taken to do all of that without becoming bitter, to pursue truth without pursuing cruelty, to hold people accountable without stopping to hate them. How, I asked. It was a genuine question and she knew it. She was quiet for a moment. "You decide what you're doing it for," she said finally. Revenge is about them, justice is about principles. But what I was trying to do in that room, she paused, that was about us. About whether we could still be a family worth being. About whether the truth could do something useful instead of just satisfying. She squeezed my hand. Character, she said quietly, is what you choose when you're hurt, not what you feel, not what you want, what you choose. I have thought about that sentence nearly every day since. Eleanor Navarro passed away the following winter, peacefully, on a Sunday morning, which felt right, since Sunday mornings had always been hers. She was 78 years old. Her funeral filled the church past capacity. Veterans sat with neighbors, sat with former patients, sat with strangers who had driven hours because they'd heard her name and needed to be there. People stood in the parking lot and listened through propped-open doors. I had attended military funerals with full honors and formal ceremony. I had never seen anything like this. Story after story was shared. Every one of them followed the same basic shape: a person at a low point, Eleanor arriving without fanfare, a life redirected. The sheer accumulated weight of it made the sanctuary feel different, charged with something I don't have a precise word for. The foundation continues its work. My father volunteers at a Veterans Assistance office every other Saturday. My mother's Tuesday meal route has expanded to include 12 households. Dominic chairs a fundraiser for veteran housing assistance each autumn, complaining about it from the moment it's announced until the moment it ends, which in his particular language is love. We are not a perfect family. We were not restored to some idealized version of what we might have been. We are just people, doing better than we were, because one extraordinary woman refused to let betrayal be the final word. There's a photograph on my desk that I look at every day. It was taken at the Veterans Center, about 6 months before Eleanor died, one of those candid shots where the subject doesn't know the camera is on them. She's standing by the window talking to a young veteran in his 20s, and whatever she's saying has made him lean forward slightly, like he's receiving something important. She's looking at him, the way she looked at everyone she decided was worth saving. Like he already has everything he needs, and she's just reminding him where it is. I carry one lesson above all others from Eleanor Navarro's life. It isn't about money, or estates, or family dynamics, or even forgiveness, though it touches all of those things. It's this. You cannot determine how people choose to treat you. You cannot rewrite their choices, or engineer their decency, or force them into integrity they haven't earned. That is not in your hands. What is in your hands is the person you become in response. When you are hurt genuinely, deeply, by people who should have known better, you face a fork in the road. One path is easier at the start. It offers the comfort of anger, the satisfaction of contempt, the relief of simply writing people off. And sometimes that's the correct choice. Eleanor would have been the first to say so. But the other path demands something harder. It demands that you hold people accountable and hold onto your own character at the same time. It demands that you pursue truth as a thing with value in itself, not just as a weapon. It demands that you remain, in the end, someone you recognize when you look inward. Eleanor chose that second path. Not because it was painless, it wasn't. Not because her family deserved it, that's a separate question. But because she understood that becoming cruel in pursuit of justice is a way of letting the injustice win twice. The strongest thing she did in her life was not the foundation, or the estate plan, or the meeting in the Veterans Center, or the years of nursing, or the decades of volunteer service. The strongest thing she did was decide, every single day, who she was going to be, regardless of what anyone around her chose to do. That decision was entirely hers. It always is. If Eleanor's story brought someone to mind, a person who shaped you through quiet sacrifice, who showed up without being asked, who believed in you when you hadn't yet earned it, consider reaching out today. Not tomorrow, not when things slow down. Today. We don't get unlimited Sundays.